listening to Red Ice Creations Radio. My name is Henrik Palmgren and this is Internet Talk Radio broadcasted from the west coast of Sweden. Good to have you along today and thank you for tuning in. We are here on Thursdays and Sundays. You can listen to our programs through our website RedIceCreations.com, REDICE Creations.com. And today we have a very interesting program ahead of us. We have Daniel Tatman from the UK with us on the line. And I actually met Daniel at the conference that we attended in Liverpool a few weeks ago. We bumped into Daniel the first day there and he shared some very interesting information with us about everything from ley lines, geomancy to architecture and the history of the town that he lives in. This is Bath, the old town in England, and Daniel is writing a book on the subject called The Bath Mysteries, and this is what we're going to focus on here today. From what I've heard so far from Daniel, what he shared with us, Bath seemed to be a fascinating place with its roots in the pre-Roman world of the Celts or the Druids. And there is so much more on architecture, history, masonry and other orders and secret societies that connects with his material on this old city. And we're going to go through this subject nice and easy. Our plan at this point is to make a kind of mini-series with Daniel on these subjects. He very recently got a blog up and he's adding new material all the time, so I do encourage you to take a look at that if you want to follow along from the beginning, so to speak. You can go to thebathmysteries.blogspot.com to check out his blog, and we're going to have that linked up also, of course, on our website. You can find the link easy from there. And Daniel is very knowledgeable on so many different subjects, so it's going to be great diving into this here today. So with that, it's a pleasure to welcome you on the program, Daniel, and thank you very much for coming on Red Ice Creations Radio.
Thanks a lot, Henrik. Brilliant to be here, it really is. It's very inspiring, a bit weird. Overall, it was brilliant to be here.
Excellent. Very nice to have you here, Daniel. And I think we're going to have a great discussion here today. What you shared with me so far is very interesting indeed. So, but before we, dive into all of the things related to Bath and so forth, let's talk a little bit about you first, so we can kind of introduce our listeners to who you are and where you're coming from, so to speak. So, if you will, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you first got involved in this subject, Daniel.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I currently live in Bath, as you mentioned, in Somerset in the UK, and I've lived here for about the last 7.5, 8 years. I was born here. At the age of 4, my family and I moved to Wales, so I grew up just underneath the Brecon Beacons, which is kind of right in the centre of South Wales. So I grew up in Wales, and so I speak Welsh and English also.
Mm.
From there, from a very early age, my parents were kind of members of what's still called now the Jesus Freak movement. So they were kind of these lefty, liberal Christians, quite open with their mindsets towards Christianity and ways of relating to theology and religion.
Mm-hmm.
So from a young age, I've always talked with my father and his friends and all of their kind of circle of friends who frequented the house, from kind of Greek Orthodox to Gnostics and sort of guys that run hippie communities in the middle of nowhere. So
right.
I had a very broad range of subjects which I was talking about with a lot of people a lot older than me.
Mm-hmm.
So I always had an interest in things of a kind of more spiritual nature from a young age. Also, I was kind of inspired by hearing of my grandfather from my mother's side. My mother and my grandmother always used to tell me kind of the story of how he had gone to Africa when he was in his late 50s with a company that he worked for called Multico,
mm-hmm.
who made woodworking machinery. And they had a lot of very big factories around the world. And they had a base hub in Nigeria. And so my grandfather, he was the head of sales for the company at the time.
Mm.
And he went over to Nigeria, and they were building a small new factory to build some quite specialist machinery in a small place in the Niger Delta called Mosoga. And the whole principle of it was that they were going to build this factory and then bring in workers from a neighbouring country to work there, because the area which they were going to bring the people from, they'd already been trained in using some of this machinery to make the other machines.
Uh-huh.
The joke of this was that they were going to have to be travelling about 300 miles a day. And so the company didn't really mind doing this because they thought they would save money by not having to train up the locals to work in the factory. And so my grandfather was there, and as a salesman he had to be very involved with the community and the people in the area. So he got to know them quite well. And he came to the board of directors of the company with the idea that perhaps they could train a few key people within the locals of Mosoga, and that they could then train the other men and workers within the village. And so they kind of thought, yeah, it was a good idea, but they didn't want to have any impetus, any input or sort of impetus in doing it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And so my grandfather came up with the idea of actually taking them with him back to his house in Surrey, where he lived in the UK, taking them to the local technical college for kind of 6-month courses, and then doing as he said, bringing them back to the village to train up the other people. Right. And so he did this over about a 3-year period. He brought over men with their wives and their children, and lots of different groups that came over to where he lived was Crawley in Surrey.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, it worked out well for the company and for the locals. And so in the end, the workers weren't brought in from the neighbouring country, and my grandfather was very well respected by the people in the company because he'd saved them money and time.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And also the locals of the village. And so because of this, they gave him the honorary title of Okakuro of Mosoga.
Mm-hmm.
And this is kind of an honorary chieftain title which can be given to somebody who's done a great deal for the tribe. They can be an outsider, they can be Chinese, white, that doesn't really matter.
Right.
But he was actually the first person in about 400 years in the mythology of the people, or the history of the people in the area, to actually receive the award. So it was quite a monumental thing in the late history of the African. So he got this title, and obviously this is great for a myth. As a young child, I grew up hearing all about his work in Africa.
Sure.
And this kind of philanthropic work, which worked out, that he'd done very well for his company, and that he'd helped out this huge group of people. And so, I grew up, idolizing the guy. I thought he was great, and as I grew up, I kind of started to look more into the subject of what he was doing in Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And just before he died, about 2 years before he died, he was actually given a CBE by the Queen. He actually went to Buckingham Palace and received a CBE, which is a commander of the British Empire.
Yeah. Huh.
And also, funnily enough, the Order of the Bath.
Huh.
Is the full title of it. And so, yeah, he got this award, and so, as I was becoming sort of 13, 14, 15, it didn't quite make sense why he'd been given this award.
Yeah, because this was a